And just like your students, you've sat as far away as possible, except for you.
Probably a student.
You're feeling more brave, you can just come up here, just creep closer like a ninja, I guess we go through. So let me tell you just a little bit of my background, and it's relevant, you'll see why in a second. So I'm a graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I did my undergraduate work, hometown school for the hometown kid. I grew up in Lincoln. So it's just always nice to be in the Midwest. I always appreciate that. And I also tell you that because I did my undergraduate work at UNL and then went to Iowa to do my master's or my graduate degrees, master's and PhD. And then I actually went to a small liberal arts college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Dickinson College, which is very, very, very old and very small, especially compared to a K-State or a UNL. And it was a completely different window into higher education and what that sort of learning environment is like. And I loved that, and I had a tremendous experience being there as a faculty member in the sociology program. But my heart is with the big state school. My heart is with the public university that's taking kids from the farms and the small towns, and these were my friends, and I know where they were coming from, and I know what they gained and they learned. And so there's both a practical sense in my mind that says if it doesn't work at the state school, it doesn't work anywhere. And also just the kind of heart and soul of it that is I know who these kids are and I know what education looks like for them. So, so that is part of my true vested interest in being here and how glad I am to be on campus, even having watched some K-State Husker games, in which I'll admit I think we got the better of you in the past.
But not the last few, though.
No, not recently. No, but I was in school. That was a long time ago. Let me just pause for a moment, just because we're a small enough group, and I really do want to keep it as informal as possible. Just so you all can get to know who's in the room, and I can know who's in the room. That would be great. So we'll start with
David Thompson. I teach at the School of Family Studies.
great. Back.
Diane, I teach in the English language program.
Brian Kovar, teaching the College of Business Management Department.
Mike Russell, psychology, I'm at Washburn University.
Okay, great.
This is the Washburn room. I'm
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay, great.
I'm the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs that's in charge of all this assessment stuff.
Nice. Okay, great.
Kelly Watt, art history.
Okay.
And Melanie Burdick, English department.
Janet Paper, a postdoc in biology.
I'm Cheryl, I'm a postdoc in math.
Bruce Lee-Moore, I teach philosophy.
At K-State. Okay, all right. We had Wichita State people earlier, so I'm getting used to the infiltrators, which is fun. And just so you know, so this is sort of geared, well, not exactly towards K-State, but so it'll have a chance to be reflective on what you all are doing at Washburn too. So here's my challenge and my opportunity for the day. So as we set up the sessions, and I suffer through this again, so bear with me here. But so the challenge was to kind of have 3 different preps for the day, and then with 2 repeats. So so I've worked very hard to try to be considerate of the fact that there's kind of different things to learn in each of the sessions. So this very early morning we had just a conversation really about the intercultural learning and competence rubric and how that applies within the College of Education. Actually with some infiltrators from Wichita State and some other people too. But so that kind of allowed us to kind of root into the programmatic evaluation around any one rubric. And then we had time set aside to do this kind of introduction to the rubrics. So I really wanted to take that time to do what I think is, well, hold on. So there's the second one, the one after this is sort of working with rubrics. So in my mind, I really wanted to have a space in the conversation where we could talk about the structure of the rubrics, how they're applied, give you some campus models of how they're actually being used and how the data is being aggregated at the institutional level. But in this one, I really wanted to take the opportunity to start the conversation around why this kind of assessment matters. And and so the personal experience that I bring to this is that I can tell you as a faculty member, I always felt like I was coming in at the middle of conversations all the time on campus, right? And so inevitably, I'd spend the first 10 minutes of that middle conversation trying to figure out what had happened in the first part of the conversation, how it involved me, and why I was standing here having this conversation. So, and you do, I mean, that's just the reality of campus life. Things are moving so quickly, there's so many layers of how decision-making happens that it's sort of an inevitable part of it. But because of that, I take very seriously the opportunity to start the conversation. And then also from a researcher standpoint, you can use any old tool you want, you know, whether it's a standardized test or a survey or a rubric, and it doesn't matter what that tool is if you don't know why you're using it, and you don't care about why you're using it. So I actually have much greater interest in you understanding why these are helpful tools and deciding for yourselves if these are helpful tools than jumping into the tool itself. So this is actually where I want to start the conversation, my little guy. The clip art for students is just terrible. So if any of you have a program or have anything to say to Mac, that would be great. They're just pathetic little things. But anyway, so this is my student. And this is the big question. To me, this is the $1 million question. It's not just to me, actually. So it's an entire organization. And I think with certain levels of national conversation, we are asking this question. I think at the government level, we're asking this question much more of a how quickly can we get students in and get them out? How can we increase the overall completion rate in higher education? This is the millennium goal that Obama had ages ago. By 2016, he was going to increase by like 2 million graduates, something like that, which is a lofty and noble goal. I think we all agree, and actually the Bureau of Labor Statistics would bear out that we do need more graduate degrees. However, we think that that's a missed opportunity to actually have a good conversation about the quality and the embodiment of what's actually happening in those degrees. So if I just asked you, at any level, I'm just sort of spitballing here, what do you think? I mean, the other way to really personalize this is to say at K-State or Washburn, what's the transformation? In what way should a student be different at the time they enter the foundational courses, by the time they leave, and perhaps even at the graduate level? But I'm not going to assume that those are all different things necessarily. But how would you respond to that?
I would say to be able to identify what the problem is that they might need to solve in any given situation.
Okay. What the problem is, great. Okay. What else?
To think critically.
Okay.
To know how to use the tools of their discipline to solve that problem.
Okay.
Maybe a couple other disciplines too.
I love the implication of application in your statement, which is not just the tools of the discipline, but the tools of this to do something else. Okay.
To read and write critically in a variety of contexts for a variety of audiences.
Right. It is a bit about that nimbleness that we're trying to equip students with to be actually able to move into different environments. Thank you, I appreciate that. Anything else? Okay. And that's meant to be a bit of a prompting, reflective exercise too, to think about. We do promise students something. We are promising them some degree of transformation and change. And I think we have some expectation that they will be different people at the time they leave than when they've entered. And so there is something that bears articulation about what we think that transformation actually is. And what's helpful then is just have the opportunity to actually begin to compare across multiple colleges and universities. Actually, the benefit of having two in the same room is to think how much different is it going to be at Washburn than it is at K-State. But of course, at the same time, there's something unique about the institution as well, and the institutional culture and climate. So that's worth exploring at the same time. But what I wanted to do first was just begin to get out some of the purposeful ways that we can articulate what we think those transformations are. So even aspects of problem solving, critical thinking, application, integration, flexibility, malleability between contexts. As a national organization, what you're getting at is basically what we have. We are a AAC&U, Association of American Colleges and Universities, is 100 years old next year. And we are an organization entirely devoted to the notion that all students, regardless of institution or institutional sector or region or whoever that student is, has equal access to a liberal education, which is exactly this. So the kinds of skills that allow students to deal with high levels of globalization, diversity, complexity. Our president likes to say all the time, it is about equipping students with the ability to deal with unscripted problems. In fact, the problems that don't yet exist. And it's a 21st century problem. We were actually just having this discussion over lunch, and Fred was raising the nice point that these are probably new things. This wasn't exactly the way that students in higher education had to operate 100 years ago. But sure enough, in the world in which we live now, these are 21st century problems, 21st century mandates to actually be able to problem solve and to be nimble and to be innovative and creative. We think this necessarily implies a level of breadth and depth of skills and development. So at the same time that we have broad foundational skills, there has to be depth and application of those skills. That most likely gets translated on campus into general education and the other stuff, or the majors and the other stuff, which is more likely actually. But if you see, one of the things we work a lot around at the association is in general education reform, and helping colleges and universities to think far more intentionally about how general education is integrated into and connected with the majors. To suggest that what you have in general education, and why you haven't yet eliminated it, because you think it is worthy of something, is that it's actually in building those broad foundational skills that in fact would be applied and cognitively developed within the majors. It's the depth, it's that depth and application through content that actually maximizes the use of those critical thinking skills, those problem solving skills. As students have picked their own passion, right? As students have centered themselves and picked what they really love, then that application is supposed to be even better. Assuming their parents haven't just made them be a business major. It would be like, we hope there's some bit of love there too. And I wanted one of you to say this, but it might have been in the back of your minds. The historical foundation of American higher education is rooted in not only educating people, it's in educating citizens. And Thomas Jefferson, in founding the University of Virginia, was very clear that what we were actually doing was equipping people with the capacity to act in a democratic society. The capacity to act however they chose, but the capacity to act. And I have yet to find an institution with a mission statement that didn't have something about personal and social responsibility in it. And like nothing else, it shows me probably the most about the institutional character of a place. There's just language that certain places can use that others wouldn't touch. It's just how it goes. There are institutions that will use very clear and straightforward language around social justice, and institutions that wouldn't touch that language.
Can you give an example?
Sure.
Okay.
Of an actual place. Well, no, there are places that absolutely wouldn't use the language of social justice. And it's because it's too biased, it's too activist for them. But they'll use language around civic professionals, or civic leadership, or engaged citizens. Christopher Newport University uses social entrepreneurship. Some people hate that term, absolutely hate that term. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's really, really fascinating. And it's because another hat that I wear is with the National Brain Theory to Practice Project, and we work with the intersection between engaged learning, civic development, and student psychosocial well-being. And so I work a lot with campuses around these civic frameworks and how they relate to other things, but those civic frameworks are totally compelling. Lewis University has a whole orientation around ethics because it has a religious affiliation that sort of, actually it's a Jesuit university, has a whole orientation around ethics. And that could be like a third rail for many, many places and many faculty. So oh, trust me, I'm going to show you yours in a second. But it's a really interesting foothold into what this conversation begins to look like on particular places. So what I think this all leads up to, and in kind of the comments that you've made, and one of the entrees that I use into this conversation is just to ask faculty about aha moments that they've seen students have, and what those have looked like, and usually thinking about what those aha moments are. There's quite a lot of construction and reconstruction of knowledge and imagination, and so what this ultimately begins to look like to me is the ways in which we're actually equipping students, not just with the knowledge, right, but enough knowledge and then enough flexing of that knowledge, and application of that knowledge to actually create something new. And usually when we talk about learning, that's the most exciting part. The most exciting thing is when they're actually doing stuff beyond where we've left off, and are beginning to make connections that we wouldn't have imagined or dreamed of, but really are just owned by them. So that becomes quite compelling. So, in just the way that I hope that we do this for students, let's get personal. And I'd like to watch for people and kind of sit back and be like, what is it that you promised? And how willing to meeting that? So the strong fighting words here are, what's the integrity of the place? What's the integrity to actually meet your institutional mission? Because if I'm a snooping student, which I was, and spent some time on your website, on the K-State website, looking around, and I don't think all students do this by any stretch of the imagination, but if I'm trying to figure out, and I swear I'm going to do this for my kids, but if I'm trying to figure out what my niece and nephew, God help them, if I'm trying to figure out what the place is about and what they're promising, then I'm starting with the mission statement. So, because if we're thinking about what should the transformation be, right? So go back 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, to where we just asked that question. And you're saying things like think critically and problem solve and integrate, be flexible enough to move between environments. I'm thinking that's not going to happen in any one course. That necessarily has to happen across multiple courses involving the curriculum, likely the co-curriculum. I mean, that's where students think they're actually going to do all their learning anyway. So what begins to be what are the ties that bind then? So this is the big challenge for faculty, to think beyond our disciplinary boxes and think about how these are actual goals and objectives for students. And how, if they're going to learn it in my class, they actually have to exercise it in your class too, to get any better at it. They probably have to fail in your class actually, and then do a little bit better at it. So what do we begin to tell them about what's valued? It's interesting, it's educated citizenry. Just like I mentioned with brain theory to practice, we're devoted to looking at that intersection with engaged learning and civic development and psychosocial well-being. I don't take this lightly at all. And I almost never see this in mission statements. Almost never. But I get really excited when I do, because it says something to me about whole student development and how that might translate into a perspective in which you might recognize and understand something about the well-being of a nation. The Gallup polls has done an unbelievable amount of research on well-being indicators. Fascinating stuff. Far more indicative of overall health of a nation versus something like GDP, which is almost exclusively how we tend to measure it. Imagine that in a capitalist society. But nevertheless, just fascinating work. So this, I don't know, I can't say enough about it. I really love what that's there. But this notion of embracing diversity, engagement, discovery, all good stuff. But something to, again, link into. It ends up, it's a very long mission statement. So I've done my best here to lift this up. There's actually a bunch of bits and pieces of it that kind of talk about different groups, which is cool. So I kind of tried to focus in on the student section of what I thought KSU would be promising me as a student. And that's, so what I want to lift up here, though, is this really important piece that's subtle, but it's super important for this conversation, which is that knowledge is part of it, but it's not all. So that's the reshifting. That's that refocusing in how we're equating areas of focus and emphases in what we're doing to say, it is knowledge. We do care about content, knowledge, of course we do, but it's not all about that. So what else are we about? And there's definitely, I highlighted this because I just don't see a lot of mission statements that emphasize extracurricular learning. In fact, acknowledging that learning happens outside the classroom, which is helpful. And again, strong statements about diversity and citizenship. And I keep coming back to that because, what K-State is working on now is, in the pilot, is written communication, oral communication, and critical thinking. And those are very familiar, sort of low-hanging fruit in the outcome world because it's just really difficult for faculty to say they don't do those things. I have heard them say they try not to do those things or they don't do those things, which is just a lie. And it's a lie that they use to get out of assessment. But, and it's like, it's so not true. And of course, no faculty is ever going to admit that they don't do critical thinking in their class. So but nevertheless, so what becomes really compelling is the point at which an institution gets to getting serious about this part of the mission statement. So that's my little seed. It's really just a seed to plant more than anything.
I hate to say low-hanging fruit because we say we do it, but you sure don't want to assess it.
Yeah. Well, or it's entirely, yeah, right.
It's definitely high-hanging fruit for us.
Well, and actually, and honestly, but this was actually what was so nice about the conversation this morning with intercultural competence. Was an actual focus on one of the personal and social responsibility areas with a heavy concentration of the conversation around activity and what they were doing as activities and how they're moving towards actually using the intercultural competence rubric to maybe assess those things. So it could be happening in pockets. And so maybe College of Ed, for example, would be a leader in that for the university, which would be exciting. And I think that's exactly how these things happen. You just have pockets of interest in movements, which are really, really helpful. But so that's something, right? Something to begin to frame what this is here. Okay. So at AAC&U, so let me begin to sort of translate. Well, or actually sort of come back down to earth. So trying to kind of get at this liberal education philosophy, kind of build our way down to what become ground level tools. So at AAC&U about over 10 years ago now at this point, almost 15 years ago, we developed a learning outcomes framework that was entirely drawn from our member institutions. So we did a survey of our 1,300 or some member institutions, slightly less than that then, and asked them, do you have institutional learning outcomes? And the vast majority said, yes, we do. I think the next question was, does anybody know about those learning outcomes? And then the percentage drops pretty radically after that. Also depends when you get the survey too. But nevertheless, so we just started asking, kind of harvesting, what is it? We did some focus groups with students and faculty and employers. And we also did content analysis of disciplinary societies and stuff. So, and then some poor person, I think, in the vice president's position, who since left AAC&U, I imagine, from fatigue and exhaustion, just sort of had all of that information laid out and developed this framework. And here's really the thing to know about it. It's basically says there's 4 broad bands, basically related to any sort of institutional list of outcomes, which are there's a knowledge or content area, which makes terrific sense. But also that it's not just about that it's also about the application of knowledge using certain intellectual and practical skills, which might be these, but certainly probably wouldn't be all of these because we don't think any institution is self-loathing enough to use all of these. And honestly, I mean, just realistically attentive enough to use all of these would be crazy. Like I just said, some band of personal and social responsibility. And then something about integrative and applied learning. This is in practicality, in my experience, this is a weird one. It shows up, but not usually as its own band, I'll be honest with you. But it's certainly implied, even in the stories that we get about learning and so forth. So it's certainly an important piece. It'll be interesting to see what we do with this framework going forward. So here's the kind of head wreck, is when somebody asks me, well, this is getting pretty complicated. Because you see, we got these institutional outcomes, and then we have these general education outcomes, and then I have my course level outcomes. How in the world would I possibly begin to deal with all those outcomes? And the head wreck is, I'd actually say they all should be the same outcomes. From a student's perspective, for sure, from a student's perspective, they need to understand that the courses that they experience here could be different, but also be exercising the same skills, with different content, but exercising the same skills. And those skills would be emphasized across general education, picked back up within the major, and then used for institutional assessment at the end. Now, there's probably formative points and formative narratives around how students are developing progressively in their cognitive development around skills at the end of Gen Ed. And I'm using that loosely because Gen Ed could extend it could extend beyond 2 years. We just tend to, sequester it there. And then certainly narratives in the majors, right? Certainly program level narratives around how students are doing. But then also some of those courses, and I added experiences here. Because I do assume that something like journal club that's happening completely in the extra curriculum to the biology program is actually a fundamental part of what that learning experiences is. I mean, Janet had a chance to tell us a little bit more about that because I just thought it was a great example of actually having all this content in the courses, but then actually having really good learning experiences outside of that. So here's what I found, again in my snooping, that's probably beyond the normal prospective student snooping, but still. I found the old Gen Ed outcomes. And look how well these align, look at that, isn't that interesting? And I thought this is really cool, this integrity one, right? And it's really about ethics, which makes great sense. And this looks very normal to me in terms of having some small core set. And to be honest with you, I do this a lot for lots of different places. And sometimes you can go in and find outcomes around, so if I put student learning outcomes in the search bar, it's always a great day if just like institutional learning outcomes pop up. That's great. And that says something about what the place is doing. A lot of times I'll get a bunch of links, and it's outcomes, human development, outcomes, sociology, outcomes, nursing, outcomes, and I'll clearly be getting the program by program list. And what I never have the time to do is actually print every damn one of those off and just see what the alignment is, because I'm sure there is going to be, at least around particular areas. So I always end up going back to Gen Ed. I almost always work my way backwards into general education outcomes because they tend to be the most broadly articulated, and if you think about it, potentially have the most capacity to actually affect students and lay that foundational work. Students don't avoid it. Depending upon the institution, how much transfer you have coming in and out, it could be 80% of all students are going through the Gen Ed program. So the ability to connect and actually have a chance to have levels of transparency and articulation, Gen Ed becomes crucial. Becomes that crucial, roots of that root system. And then this is the case study. So this is the new outcome areas that have been articulated. This one's super tricky, and it's it really is. But a lot of institutions are grappling with this. In fact, I just had a conversation the other day of somebody asking, what do we do? We have this aesthetic appreciation thing. And I was like, I don't know. But I know lots of other people are trying to think about it, so that might actually vary. Visual literacy, aesthetic appreciation, that could very well be one of the emerging rubrics that we develop. But you can begin to see some, just how stuff gets translated. And really all I'm going for in showing you this is that you have articulation, and that you probably, having seen yours, probably do have some articulation that some really clever, smart, prospective student could find somewhere on your website. And it would be really interesting to see where the conversation starts. So not as a definitive point, and not to say that just, that you're going to assess the mission statement, but beginning to see how you might have finer levels of articulation that become more and more accessible. And probably for the larger imperative, it's more of a shared understanding, a collective understanding of expectations of what student learning ought to be at the institution. Knowing that there's specific content areas and knowledge goals, but at the same time, some shared strands around particular outcomes. Questions about that? Okay, so I just wanted to show you this quickly. And you have a little bit of this employer data, but I was trying to think and be sensitive.
I know. Is it over here? Oh, thank you.
I'll show you the resource from where this comes from in a second, but I wanted to, what I hear time and time again, and there's quite a lot of national press on the value of an undergraduate degree and what it is that employers are looking for, and our college graduates are underemployed or not employed, they're living in the basement, they're still living in the basement, and all these things, right? We actually have some pretty good data around what employers want and what they're saying. And it's not just our data. I have sources from our data. We've been collecting employer data for about 10 years. But Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce, Anthony Carnevale's stuff is not our stuff, and he doesn't do AAC&U speak, which is kind of why I like to talk about his stuff. He's a hardcore economist, and he does some amazing analysis of Bureau of Labor statistics and has found some really interesting parallel findings. So, but this is just really nicely synthesized. But anyways, we just had this study that came out in 2013, and what we really tried to do was begin to position how much employers are actually valuing the breadth and depth piece. And what we're hearing in the national narrative is this job training is all about job training. Well, great, we're training students for very specific jobs that tap out at some point. They're not career jobs, they're jobs. They're not careers, they're jobs. And anybody's had a career and had a job knows the difference. So again, trying to think about getting these, I have a colleague at an institution who's terrified that her son wants to be a sociology major. Oh, I know, thank you. And I reminded her like 12 times that I'm a sociologist. that more unsettling, has done nothing to dissuade her at all. But I keep coming back to this notion, this thing of what these skills are. So just asking as random sample of employers, again, we can give you the methodology behind this. We really had a diverse set of employers that fell into this. What sort of emphasis on these skills would you want to place? You can see more emphasis on these things combined with the same emphasis in basically on all these with high 90s. Analysis of complex problems, communication skills, ability to apply things to real-world situations, info literacy, the ability to actually locate and organize vast amounts of information. By the way, this 21st century problem.
I was gonna say, I don't think I'm equipped for that one. It's a pretty complex world we live in.
Absolutely. Well, and so, and this is the kind of come to Jesus moment with our content delivery system, which is to say, actually, students have a ton of access to content, way more than's actually helpful to them. So in that environment, what becomes most crucial is for us to teach them how to parse and synthesize the amount of content, the sheer volume of content that's out there. Innovation and creativity, right? It is a new complex world where we expect new problem solving to arise all the time. Teamwork is my favorite outcome right now. It's just like one of my favorites. So almost to 90% and 67% went more of this it is now the rare place that people are able to work in isolation. It might just be higher ed. And I think that's evaporating. And actually, I have to admit, we run. I'm way off topic now, but we run this institute on general education and assessment in the summer. I co-direct it with a colleague, and we're actually handing out the teamwork rubric this summer because they come in teams, because faculty from institutions come in teams to work on a concentrated problem. And we've just decided that's actually one of their participant outcomes for the institute. It's just the new state of Texas core curriculum has teamwork as an outcome. And they don't know how the hell they're going to do it. They're all terrified. They're all like, yay us, but they're totally terrified. We do have a teamwork rubric, though, in the set of rubrics that we have at AAC&U. So they're starting with that, but it's going to be interesting. Anyway, ethics has skyrocketed over the 10 years that we've done employer data. It's really interesting how much it's ballooned. Basic quantitative literacy is, of course, still and always will be incredibly important. I wanted to show you this one because it gets a little bit more of this personal and social responsibility, and I just wanted to juxtapose that quickly. Very important that the employees have skills, fairly important. Ethics is very important. Comfortable working with people from diverse backgrounds. Probably imagine that's going to increase a bit. Demonstrate capacity for professional development, continue new learning. So equipping students with skills for lifelong learning. You know, that embedded curiosity, the desire to learn more. Still important. Now see how this changes, especially these. This is going to be a great paradox here. This knowledge of global cultures, histories, values, and religions. Juxtapose that with this one.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, so interest in giving back to communities.
I would like to know where that came from, you know, like what brought that to such a large amount.
For over here, for the fairly important?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, yeah. And here's the other one. A bit paradoxical, no? How do you equip people to be empathic, insensitive, and thoughtful?
No.
It's interesting, right?
Like this is great theory. How do you implement this? You know.
Well,
that's another
for all our historical roots and foundations, and I can get quite passionate talking about the civic engagement stuff, and that historical mission of higher education, we have done a very, very poor job of communicating that both to our students and then to the wider community of what that actually means and is.
That's what's been going through my head a lot is that I'm with you on being passionate about civic engagement, and that's a big thing. That should be a big part of education at every level. And I think the issues that you're talking about with ethics and civic engagement, it used to be that K-12 used to be really, really good at that. You know, talking about how to be an ethical person, what are moral issues about other cultures. And now with Common Core, that's being taken away because it's all career and college ready, but what they see as college ready are these only academic skills.
I know.
And I think we're not communicating to them that we really do value these other themes.
Yeah.
So I'm concerned that what's going on in the schools is going to make it even harder for us to teach these things when these kids come up.
Yeah. And even the expansion of the Common Core beyond language arts and math.
Yeah.
I believe their first area is in ethics after that. I think it's like history.
It's not really.
Yeah. No, it's a challenge, but again, I don't know why these challenges are necessarily any different than what we have now. We will have the students that are coming to us, and it will be our job to educate them.
I guess I feel like we should communicate that, like you said, to the public.
I do.
What we're doing.
No, I absolutely do. There is a storytelling that needs to happen broadly here, for sure. There's so much more I can say about that, but I won't.
Yeah, this is
I can't.
opens a lot of doors.
Oh yes, that's a total Pandora's box. I'm sorry, I shouldn't even forget about that. So what really matters to students, though, is for all our great waxing, poetic and all the great passionate arguments we can make about any of these outcomes. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the students want to know what you're talking about. Otherwise, they're going to think things like this.
I would say this is true.
Yeah. I didn't make these up. These are actually from I'm sorry I didn't add the extra parentheses there. I don't know what happened. But This is actually from a research study a colleague and I did with focus groups of students across the country, asking them about a number of different learning experiences, but they're quite articulate. They're quite articulate about both what learning is, and I have a whole set of slides on this. I don't have time to show you. Actually, videos posted online, YouTube videos of they consented.
It would be good to do a follow-up a year later after starting a job, if how they feel about their education now that they've graduated and they're in employment.
I agree.
Yeah.
It would be better if that school actually had some intentionality to actually connect their education to employment. I would love to see that. But I did mention earlier this morning, 50 minutes. How did I do 50 minutes? I'm having these nightmare flashbacks back to courses I taught in 50 minutes, and I was like, it felt just like this. Oh my God. We talked about just where resources are, all the different resources of alumni. The Alumni Center is a great way to think about how you can get some of these outcomes after the fact in really meaningful ways, just ways to engage. The real point here, though, is to think about how much transparency actually matters to students. That if you figure out how to get on board and you figure out what's happening with assessment and what the outcomes are, if you still haven't figured out a way to articulate the students, you still will have failed. It's ultimately, at the end of the day, it is theirs. It is theirs to sell themselves, it's theirs to market themselves, it's theirs to tell themselves that they own and have these capacities. And if they can't do that, then you still will have failed. So how do you begin to start that process of articulation? So you see I've gotten 45 minutes in, and I haven't mentioned, well, sort of the word rubric. And the great intent of that is to try to start the conversation around what is it that really matters, what are we actually trying to give to students, what are the outcomes that really matter to you. And if you're not using data or instruments that give you that part of the narrative, don't use them. Then you're wasting precious assessment capital. So it takes a lot of institutional moxie, I know, to stop doing things. But it is worth carefully considering what sort of data you should have to be able to articulate something. So bear with me here. So this photo I grabbed from the web, and the title for this photo is the Center for Innovation, which I just thought was hilarious. I just thought that was hysterically funny. There's nothing innovative happening in this picture whatsoever.
Is that ours?
What's that?
Is that ours?
No, it's not. No, it's not. I don't actually, for what's good, because I would totally give it away probably. What's good, I can't remember where it's at. But it reminded me that part of, as we're having this conversation, is it will take more than just calling it something. Right? So just calling it innovative doesn't mean it's really going to be innovative, right? And I think what we're talking about then is this really profound paradigm shift of a whole new image, a whole new image and way of contextualizing what it is we're doing. And I think at minimum, we're talking about these things and see if this makes sense to you. I think we're at minimum talking about demonstrated levels of competence. We can ask students if they can critically think. We can ask students if they can write. We can ask them if they're engaged citizens, and I'm guessing, and years of indirect SE data would tell you this, they're going to be wildly optimistic about those things. That really, that data exists, I can show it to you. And that's says something about their confidence. It probably says a lot more about the investment that they've made. It behooves them to believe that they have learned something, and I would hardly blame them for that. But we do have to do a much better job of gathering demonstrated evidence of their actual performance and ability to demonstrate these things. It is at the very least going to be across multiple dimensions. We're talking about highly complex skills that actually have multiple things to be doing right. So it's not the one thing that makes you a good writer, it's actually doing multiple things well. Same with critical thinking, same with integrative learning, same with being civically engaged. And we're talking about over levels of time. Right? So there's going to be increasing levels of cognitive complexity. We think there's going to be some kind of scaffolding effect. Have you ever read a paper you wrote as a first-year student?
Oh, yes, I have.
I have one. And just, every once in a while. That is the most humbling thing to yourself. To remember what you actually started at, you smarty pants. Yeah. And just to have a moment and a window into, you can actually end up being a super, super smart person and have really basic fundamental grammar errors. And really poor organizational sorts of stuff, of course, you're 17, whatever. So really think about what that overtime piece looks like. And here's what I mean about that fundamental cognitive sort of paradigm shift is, so after, I mentioned the Institute, so after one of the Institutes a handful of summers ago, one of the things that teams have to do is create an action plan before they leave the Institute. They turn this in, obviously, it's for them, it's not for us. But it's so that they'll have a model to come back to. So when they get back to campus and they don't stall out, right? Everybody kind of goes their separate ways. They really have a plan for moving forward. And I was reading one of these, and it's at Manchester Community College, and they said, what we really need to do is, the first thing we need to do when we get back to campus is help our faculty feel more like coaches. And I just thought, that's it. That's the shift. And I don't know, I mentioned this earlier, I don't know if it's because I'm from Nebraska and sports are God in Nebraska, but that just so connected with what I envision for what the new faculty paradigm is, at least for teaching. I'm not talking about necessarily scholarship or all the rest of things that this is what we do, but this notion of not just imparting content, but the notion of what our true fundamental place is in that classroom is to help students get a little bit better. And I think that is what the coach always brings to the scenario. You always had good people on your team and bad people on your team, and your job is to help each and every one of them get a little bit better. And then there's something about, athletic prowess that kind of takes the blame game out of it. But we do a lot of blaming students for things that they don't have any control over. So I really would like, and particularly underserved students, which is heartbreaking. So I'm guessing K-State, like Nebraska, is a place with a lot of first-generation students at the very least, if not transfer students and so forth. So thinking about what are the ways in which we're thinking about progressive levels of development, and what does it mean to actually assess in ways that helps lift up the notion that students can get a little bit better. Okay? Not that everybody's going to become an A student or whatever, but just helps them get a little bit better on the skills. So this is moving into the next little bit, and I don't know, are you all able to stay? Are you leaving? What are you doing? You're leaving.
Like by 2:30, yeah.
Okay. Because this is what these are actually sort of bridging slides and going over into the next thing. But so let me just do this for a minute just to kind of show you what we're going into, and this is what it's all leading up to, is to say that the rubrics were basically created as tools that would help do exactly those things on the last slide. What you're seeing, for example, if you look at, it doesn't matter which one you look at, but when you look at the grid, and basically in the next hour, we're just going to walk through the actual structure of this.
I come from both the introductions and I missed the red part.
Sorry. But what you're seeing are on the left side, again, we're going to take a much finer detail on this, but on the left side are those multiple dimensions. Well, the whole thing is about demonstrated competence. It's meant to be embedded assessment used with assignments and so forth. And then the bar at the top, the capstone, milestone, benchmark, cognitive development across undergraduate learning. So it's not neatly tied to senior, junior, sophomore, and so forth, but it is meant to be that cognitive development. I'll explain why a little bit more. But let me just pause there and just ask me if you have any questions before we transition.
I have a question going back to your sports metaphor. Because, and maybe I'm not understanding what you mean by transparency here.
Okay.
Because I do feel like if you're very transparent with the student of this is exactly what you're being evaluated on,
Yeah.
you start to go down that slippery slope of how many points do I get for this, how many points do I get for this, and what builds my grade. And the thing that great coaches do, I played sport, up through the college level, and they're like, shut up and do it because I told you to do it. You but why all of a sudden you had to run all of those sprints?
Right.
So, how much, do you just mean transparency in the fact of we're doing critical thinking? We're, besides the content, here are some other aspects, and I'm being transparent that these are class goals?
Yeah.
Or really truly, how can you use transparency of assessment and evaluation effectively?
Okay, so let me give you a
And you
super
have
hot
6 minutes, so I have to leave.
I can name that tune in like a minute. Okay, so University of Nebraska Lincoln just happens, I swear to bias, has now, in the last 20 years, so conveniently was after I graduated, thanks guys, has redeveloped their general education program. So they have now the Achievement Centered Education, ACE program, very clever. So on first year orientation, the 8 longest hours of my life ever at that institution, horrible. I hope they've also revamped that, was they give every student an ACE playing card. And on the back, and I was meant to ask them what the ACE is, ACE of what, but on the back is the student learning outcomes, of which, think of the K-State 8, they're very, very similar to those. So then, okay, so imagine that transparency. First time you hit campus, you get this little ACE playing card, and they will say that students have recognition. They have recall of the playing card, they may not have the learning outcomes. They do have the playing card, which is better than, you know, most of us are doing. So imagine then, so now I get to go off track, but imagine then going now into a classroom where you've got the outcomes on the syllabus that are perhaps tagged with a little husker or a little something that marks the institutional learning outcome, and then handing the student the critical thinking rubric. That's what I mean about layers of transparency. It begins to become clear to students that these are clear institutional goals that regardless of the class, regardless of the program, the institution cares about, and I am expected to improve on these by the time I graduate.
It's much better than saying the outcomes are blah, 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 I have to say.
Yeah, but I also, there's always something, this is why students like assignment sheets, right? This just drove me nuts as a faculty member. It's like, why do you need the assignment sheet? Don't you just listen to what I say to you and go do it?
Yeah.
This was my lack of appreciation for learning. And learning is hearing and seeing. So the visual cues are incredibly important. And remember that it's not just the visual cues of a definition, it's the visual cues that we actually expect that this is going to be hard and this is going to be flexed over time.
So I'm kind of curious about the value of uniformity. So far I've heard two sorts of lines of reasons for thinking uniformity is values. The first is it gives a way to move assessment, which actually happens at the course level up to assessment at the university level. And the second is if we give the university outcomes again and again and again in every course to the students, they get to see those as
Does the student think what?
If the students see the institutional outcomes again and again and again on course syllabi, they recognize those as institutional aims that they should take seriously.
Right.
So those are the two I've heard so far. Am I missing any? Is there a third or fourth reason for uniformity? Common rubric?
I mean, other than the ones that you would create yourselves, in my mind, what we're talking about is institutional storytelling about student learning. And that implies some threads. Doesn't mean that every single thread is the same, but it implies some common threads of what learning is across the institution.
Okay, surely that purpose is served by a university specification of outcomes. So what I'm asking is, why do we want a common rubric for writing or critical thinking and political? Because what I do in writing is importantly different in essentially every respect except their words on a screen or a page. And what happens in an English program or a journalism program or when the biologist decides to teach writing, right? This is a completely different set of skills in lots and lots of ways. So what advantage is there here for a common rubric, right?
The advantage of the common rubric is entirely from the student's perspective, to understand that writing is something that is, well, and the rubrics are supposed to be an articulation of the institution and the people at that institution, not the institution itself, but the faculty and the co-educators at that institution agreeing to a common set of standards without standardization, but a common set of standards and expectations for student learning. And it's important for students to understand that in some interdisciplinary case, when they talk with employers, for example, they should be able to articulate what that skill is. And it doesn't mean that it can be the only rubric. So if you have a writing rubric at the institutional level, there could be one that you're using for sure. But at some point, some of your assessment of student work ought to be using that institutional level rubric at the same time, so that you have institutional level data to give. It's not that you have to use it to the exclusion of other kinds of assessments you would use, but it's one way to keep the narrative consistent.
So if there's nothing common between what I'm doing and what they're doing in the English program, then
There's nothing common?
there are written words on the page. But I mean, really, so that's the difference between, right, technical writing, a very specific kind of technical writing, and a magazine piece, right, for a popular audience. There's not a lot in common there.
Between that and just writing, they would do it in an English course or something like that?
Well, no, between writing, technical writing, right, and writing a, so, but anyway, it doesn't matter what these, if there's nothing in common, then we shouldn't have, we should have, at the university level, distinct rubrics. And if there, distinct outcomes. And if there is something in common, then we ought to have a common rubric which has questions which are invariant across disciplines. Is that right?
Well, I think the assumption that technical writing has no implication or bearing on other kinds of writing is a big assumption. And I'm not a technical writer, but technical writing has an audience, it has a form, it has a genre, those are all dimensions of the rubric. So I would just challenge the notion that it's an entirely separate format. And honestly, that's just not a different argument that I've heard with regard to something like critical thinking, when biologists say, oh, well, the critical thinking that we do in biology is so much different than the critical thinking
Yeah, that's because you're not talking to a philosopher. It is in
whatever.
fact different.
Well, maybe it is. But I'm suggesting that there still have to be ways that you're accountable to institutional learning outcomes. So there still have to be ways in which
let me put it different. So you're a sociologist, so let's think about measurement theory, right? So I've got a variable and I want to assess it. Is this really getting a construct of interest? I build a panel of instruments and I connect them to the outcome, right? And I test for validity in various ways. Yeah. Okay. So I can assess university level outcomes in two different ways. Okay. So I can say here are the arbitrary sets of course level assessments that I think have some bearing on the university level outcome. Right. And then that's my panel instrument, and I can test whether or not I've got iterator validity or right. Yeah. So what those tell you, that's up for debate, but I can do those, right? I can perform those statistical tests. Differently, I can say I'm going to have one question or some three questions which are common to everybody.
Yep.
Right. Well, I've heard you say what I thought was both. So now, I mean, what's the actual, which one should we be doing?
No, I think both work. I wouldn't stand and argue that your program assessment has to match up explicitly and exclusively with institutional assessment. But I do think at the program level assessment, there has to be some role, some contribution to institutional level work. So you've got to figure out where that alignment is. But you still have.
So, but it's perfectly okay to do that by saying, okay, here are I have distinct questions at the program level, but they bear some content relation to, and that's sufficient.
That makes sense to me.
So, right, so.
Yeah. And I think we need that autonomy for programs, actually. Usually, it's in terms of content knowledge, and you want assessment for content knowledge, which makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.